Italians, they're the past. We're the future. They just don't know it yet. Fargo.
Fargo is based on the Coen Brothers movie. What feels like 1,000 years ago now, FX had an idea to make a show out of Fargo. In my mind, it was an anthology series in which each year is a completely self-contained story. Over the years, I've been excited to play with how much I can expand a story or take it in a different direction and still have it feel like Fargo. And this year it felt like if we were going to look at America, we should look at, on some level, the original sin of American capital, which is the exploitation of free and cheap labor. It's slavery and the exploitation of immigrants, especially in the early history of America. It's an epic story. It's a period story. It's set in 1950, and it's basically about these two crime families, one run by Chris Rock and the other by Jason Schwartzman. It's this moment in which you have a collision in Kansas City in 1950 between African Americans who are moving up from the South and Italian Americans who have come over in the last 20 or 30 years. And neither of these groups is considered white at this moment in 1950. They're both outside the mainstream American experience, and they're both fighting to get inside the mainstream American experience. And so what I find interesting is you have this real power struggle by two groups that don't have real power. But what they have, they've earned with blood and struggle, and they will fight to the death to hold on to it. The characters and the story were created and written, in 2018, 2019. This conversation we're having about race at this moment is a long overdue conversation, but it's also a conversation we've been having since the beginning of this country. So there's no moment this season would have premiered that it would have been irrelevant. It just feels more acute right now that we're actively having this conversation. I think there were a lot of decisions that I made early on, like the decision not to have a cop be the moral center of this story, that have definitely proven to be a good choice. I did it because in telling a story about African Americans and immigrants, a lot of their experience of law enforcement is not as the pillar of moral justice. And yet, in a crime story, you need a cop, and you need morality. But I thought in a kind of rear window way to take this young biracial girl whose parents are undertakers and who lives across the street from this nurse who she begins to suspect is taking care of her patients in more ways than one, to allow her to be the cop in this season in a moral way. And that allowed me to take the characters that are actual cops, like Jack Houston's character, Tim Oliphant's U.S. Marshal, and allow them to be more morally complex or even compromised in a way that can reflect reality. In America, we root for the criminal, which, if you think about the crime movies that we all love, The Godfather, Goodfellas, our hero is always the criminal and not the victim, and that's such an interesting facet of our world that we've trained ourselves to root for the people who take from other people, in some ways because there's a kind of American ideal to it. They didn't call them robber barons for nothing. We're not trying to lecture anyone or moralize to anyone. We're just telling a good old-fashioned crime story, for lack of a better word, but we're doing it as inclusively as possible and with our eyes open as much as possible. There's a line in the season this year where Jason Schwartzman's character says, "Do you know why Americans love a crime story? Because America is a crime story."